Hi, folks. Welcome, welcome. We have about a minute and then we will go ahead and get started. So glad to have everybody here. So I am Shyle Reuter. I'm the Education Outreach Director at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm happy to be here with you today for this 2-hour session. Also, this session is sponsored by Oregon Realtors. We really appreciate the partnership that we have with Oregon Realtors to continue to bring education to real estate agents, because we know how important your position is and your job is as we are creating a more equitable housing landscape for those who live in our state. So really, really happy to be here today talking to all of you. I will let you know, since it's a 2-hour session, we will also be taking a break. We'll be taking a 10-minute break at about 50 after the hour. So let's talk a little bit about the organization that I work for, the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We were founded in 1990, so we've been around for about 34 years. We work to promote equal housing access by providing education, outreach, technical assistance, and enforcement opportunities specifically related to federal, state, and local fair housing law. So who do we serve? Basically, anyone who's involved in the housing and rental market who might have a fair housing question or concern. Also, anyone who may be experiencing illegal housing discrimination. Anybody who supports individuals and families who are members of protected classes. We support lenders, renters, landlords, lawmakers, realtors, housing providers in understanding fair housing law. So what are the requirements to receive services from our organization? The Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we provide advocacy services regardless of income or immigration status. We do not charge fees for our advocacy services. Our clients' information is kept confidential and they can feel safe calling the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We also offer services in English, Spanish, and we also use the language bank for other languages outside of English and Spanish as well. So the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we are a statewide civil rights organization and we have staff across the entire state of Oregon. So we've got staff in Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon, the North and Central Coastal region, the Willamette Valley, and also the Portland metro area. So we are a civil rights organization that covers the state. However, we're not a very large organization. We have about 20 employees total. So lots of lifting and lots of work for a small organization. Our organization also works to proactively promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion. And we do this through education. So we educate everybody across the board that touches the housing process. So housing consumers, advocates, case managers, nonprofit housing providers, shelter providers, housing authorities, mom and pop landlords, property management companies, governmental bodies, realtors, mortgage lenders, financial institutions. So providing education for everybody touching the housing process. We also have an enforcement department. So we look at education as prevention, but we know that prevention doesn't always work. So we do have an enforcement program where people can call and contact if they believe that they have experienced housing discrimination. Additionally, we also do some public policy work as well to create systemic change to help promote a more equitable housing landscape. So what is fair housing law? Fair housing law is it's civil rights law that promotes equal access to housing. So we often think of civil rights law as the law that makes it illegal for people to be treated differently, maybe in schools or the library, on the bus, at their job. And this is because of who they are or their identity. So think of fair housing law as civil rights law that is specific to housing. So it's treating someone differently in any housing transaction because of that person's protected identity. We call that protected class. Um, Also, fair housing law comes into play if somebody is treated differently in any housing transaction because of their protected identity under federal, state, or local fair housing law. So we're going to talk more about those protected classes in a little bit. So these laws really make it illegal for housing providers to discriminate against those certain groups of people. And to be clear, realtors are considered housing providers because you are part of that process that is helping to create housing opportunity, provide housing to people looking for housing. So, what is fair housing? Fair housing is the right of all people to be free from illegal discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing. So, we're talking about fair housing actually touching any type of a housing transaction, including, selling or buying of housing as well. So as we go through this presentation, you're going to hear me use the word discrimination, and I want to be really clear about what that is, and I want to make sure we have a shared definition of housing discrimination. This means treating a person differently in any type of a housing transaction because that person is a member of a protected class. Or we could also say a person being treated differently because of their protected identity. So the Fair Housing Act reached. Fair housing applies essentially to all housing, to everyone, at all times. So we're talking about sales, mortgage, title, escrow, home insurance, landlording, property management. HOAs also have to follow for housing, condo associations, low income tax credit housing, facilities, shelters, group homes, also jurisdictional bodies. So literally the Fair Housing Act touches everybody, anybody who is connected to housing at all and at all times. So let's talk about these federally protected classes. So you've heard me say protected class or protected identity. We have several different levels of protected classes. We have protected classes on a federal level, we have them on a state level, and then also some jurisdictions will add additional protections. So the Fair Housing Act, how that actually came about is the Civil Rights Act was initially passed in 1964. Housing was supposed to be part of that initial Civil Rights Act of 1964. However, it was found very quickly that even people who were sympathetic towards civil rights, most of them wanted to maintain residential or neighborhood segregation. And so housing had to be removed from that 1964 Civil Rights Act, or it never would have passed in the first place. So then the Fair Housing Act basically floundered in committee for another 4 years. It was discussed, but then often tabled. It was a very conservative senator that oversaw that committee, and he had no desire to see the Fair Housing Act become law, and so basically kept it tabled in committee. And then in 1968, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. What happened as a result of that assassination is there were riots in over 125 cities. What those riots did is it created enough political pressure for Congress to move the Fair Housing Act out of committee and to actually vote it into law. So less than a week after the assassination of Dr. King, we see the Fair Housing Act being signed into law. The first 4 protected classes that were added in 1968 were race, color, national origin, and religion. In addition to the Civil Rights Act, the Women's Equality Act was definitely moving forward, women's rights. That was gaining momentum. And so then in 1974, we see sex being added as a protected class. Sex initially meant gender at birth. It has been expanded under this current presidential administration to include survivors of domestic violence, sexual orientation, and also gender identity as well. Now, familial status, also families with children, that was added as a protected class in 1988. Prior to 1988, nearly 70% of landlords in the rental market in Oregon would not rent to families with children. Now, we know that discrimination is still happening, though, against families with children. I did a training like this for realtors a couple years ago in Southern Oregon, and there was one of the realtors that mentioned to me, she said, I was trying to sell a condo in an HOA community, and the HOA board president specifically told me he didn't want me to sell this condo to anybody that had a kid or anybody that had an animal, even if it was an animal for disability, right? So we know that familial status discrimination is happening. We also know that disability discrimination is still happening. So in 1988, we also see disability being added as a protected class. So with that, the independent living movement had been going on for a few decades, and it was also gaining strength and momentum. Also, some of you may remember, I remember, Reagan was starting to close down institutional settings, and so people were moving out into the community and finding that they did not have equal access to housing choice. So what we saw then was this being added as a protected class to create more rights for that group that was being discriminated against. Now, the reality is, I threw out that statistic about familial status, 70% of landlords discriminating against families with children. We're talking about these different types. We can pull up statistics like that really for any one of these groups, which frankly is why we have these protections in the first place. And something I also want to mention that as we go through this training and you think about protected classes, we all belong to protected classes. So it's not just, it's not just marginalized groups. We are usually all part of marginalized groups with specific identities that we have in some way, shape, or form. Oregon protected classes. So we see marital status being added. So if somebody's married, single, widowed, or divorced, that should not matter in a housing transaction. Sometimes where you'll see that in home sales is where people are wanting to prioritize only selling their home to a married couple, not an unmarried couple. That should never come into play in that home buying or selling transaction. Source of income is also protected. Now, this really speaks more specifically towards the rental market instead of the home buying process. But source of income is protected, which means housing subsidies, housing vouchers. So a housing provider can't say, like, I won't rent to you because you have a Section 8 voucher. But we know that that happens. Also, agency rent payments get those same kinds of protections. And also benefits like TANF, SSI, SSDI, they're not expressly listed in the law. Legislative intent did call them out. And so we know cases that have settled in favor of a complainant when they've been discriminated against because they had those other types of public benefits. Now, sexual orientation, you heard me say earlier that sexual orientation, gender identity is protected on the federal level. That's new to this presidential administration. However, they have been protected on the state level for quite some time. Also, we have landlord tenant law that adds protections for survivors of domestic violence as well. So that also basically makes survivorship of domestic violence a state protected class. And then also other local jurisdictions will add additional protected classes. So for example, Multnomah County, Beaverton adds age over 18 and occupation. We see age over 18 oftentimes added into towns that have colleges. So landlords will try to say things like, I don't want to rent to anybody who's between the ages of 18 and 24, but who's between the ages of 18 and 24? It's college students, right? So landlords in those local jurisdictions where that is an age protection cannot say that they will not rent to people under that age threshold. Also occupation, we see that being added in Beaverton, Multnomah County. Occupations also protected in Salem, also Eugene as well. The two occupations in Oregon that are most discriminated against, one is exotic dancers, because there's all of these assumptions that will go along with if a person is an exotic dancer, then they must be involved in X, Y, and Z. And here's the whole purpose of these laws is that housing providers should not be assuming behavior of a person based on their protected identity. So should not be going off of assumptions. Housing providers are absolutely allowed to go off of what comes up in, background checks, in credit checks, things like that are coming up for folks, but not off of assumptions. Also, the second most discriminated against occupation is attorneys. And I think the assumption there is if a person is an attorney, that they would, possibly sue that housing provider. But again, you're not allowed to go off of assumption. So let's talk about who has to follow fair housing laws. So basically from this list, you see everybody that's touching the housing market. We've got sellers, buyers, property managers, maintenance staff, homeowners associations, real estate agents, mortgage lenders and financial institutions, insurers, neighbors, jurisdictions, and also advertising media. We're going to be talking more about advertising a little bit later. So while it may be tempting to focus on for instance, on certain HOAs, landlords, or apartment complexes with particularly poor reputations, you can see from this list that the possibility of discrimination actually spans much wider than just those very specific like HOAs, landlords, or apartments. So a recent example that we heard about happened in California, where there was an African-American couple that had bought a home and they'd done a lot of renovation on it, and they wanted to refinance. And then they had the house appraised. So the appraisal came back at a price that they knew was way below the value of the home. So the couple scheduled a second appraisal by a different company. But this time they removed from their home all signs of their African-American identity. And then they had a white friend stand in as the only person at the home when the second appraisal was done. This time, the appraisal of the home valued nearly $500,000 more than what the first appraisal had come up with. This couple, of course, took that home appraiser to court for illegal discrimination. I'm gonna see, I do see that there is a question in the Q&A, and basically, since it's just me, when we're at the break, I'll get to the Q&A questions. And so when we come back, I will answer those Q&A questions. And then also at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A questions as well. So fair housing law applies to dwellings. So what do we mean when we talk about housing? The Fair Housing Act uses the term dwelling, and it defines a dwelling as any building, structure, or portion thereof which is occupied as or designed or intended for occupancy as a residence. So while there may be some room for interpretation there, consider whether a person is using the space as their primary residence and address during that time of occupancy. So dwellings are houses, apartments, regardless of the number of units, condominiums, floating homes, mobile homes, retirement housing, assisted living, nonprofit housing and shelters, and then also at times motel rooms, hotel rooms, vacation rentals. So an example of this, when we had the fires in Southern Oregon that basically wiped out towns, a lot of folks were moving into hotels, motels, and vacation rentals, and they were actually living there. So it wasn't that this place was just somewhere that they were staying temporarily anymore. This is their actual home address where they're going to and from work every single day, to and from school, to and from appointments. Then that motel, that hotel, that vacation rental actually is considered a dwelling under fair housing law. And that housing provider has to then follow fair housing law rather than public accommodation law. So important to realize that. So let's review. The basics of fair housing is that people have the right to choose where they live, regardless of their protected class. Realtors need to be consistent in how they're responding to inquiries from prospects, in carrying out practices and procedures, and in conducting all aspects of transactions. So one of the things that we see is that if a realtor starts to become inconsistent, for example, in how they're responding to inquiries or inconsistent in how they carry out their practices, from a fair housing perspective, the question that gets asked is, why is there that inconsistency? Right? So with other folks that realtor is serving, there's, the realtor is getting back to inquiries right away, but the one that they're not getting back to, is it because of that person's race, color, religion, national origin, because of disability, because of sex, because of, right? So we start asking those questions. What is different about that person that realtor is not working consistently with? So really important in your practice to be consistent in all stages of that home selling or home buying process. So let's talk a little bit about history, Oregon's history, and specifically, we're really going to focus in on history as it relates to either being able to buy property, land, or being blocked the opportunity to live here or buy property or land. So Oregon has a history of institutional displacement, exclusion, and segregation that really date back to its time as a territory. So some examples of this: Indigenous people were forced off of or forced from their homes, forced from their land, and there was a significant loss of life because of this. Roughly 70 to 80% of Indigenous people died from epidemics that were brought by whites. There were also exclusion laws, restrictive deeds, and sundown towns that continued into the 60s and 70s, those sundown towns. Exclusion laws were in place and removed at certain points. So, for example, exclusion laws for certain people of race or national origin to even live in the country or live in Oregon. There's also bans on land and home ownership for Black, Chinese, and Japanese people at different times in Oregon's history. We also saw the forced internment, the concentration and work camps during World War II for Japanese and Japanese communities in Portland, and the Japanese communities in Portland ultimately then disappeared as a result of that. Also, there was violence against members of communities. There were lash laws that were put in place. So if an African-American person was actually found in the Oregon Territory, they would be subject to lash laws, which meant whippings by the constable of the proper county every 6 months until they left. When Oregon was a territory, there was this real hotly contested debate as far as would it allow the institution of slavery or would it not allow the institution of slavery? And the decision was Oregon would not allow slavery because the belief was it created unfair work competition. But it was also decided that Black people could not live in the territory as well. And so those lash laws were put into place as a deterrent for Black people to move into the Oregon Territory. And then when we became a state, then what we saw was laws being written into the Constitution that said Black people were not allowed to live here. Now, those laws were ultimately, of course, repealed, but the language wasn't removed into the Oregon Constitution until 2001. So, I mean, all of that has a pretty significant effect on people that are, living here or wanting to move here. Also, these laws and practices throughout Oregon's history have created barriers and have had a disparate impact on Indigenous, Black, Chinese, Japanese, Latinx, and other people as well. So one of the things that we see about home ownership, right, and not having equal access to housing is that will affect then educational opportunity, that will affect wealth accrual for individuals, for generational wealth accrual, and also it will affect general health and well-being as well. So certain examples that we see that affected this: redlining, real estate associations not mixing neighborhood rules and exclusion laws as a barrier to home access, not having integrated neighborhoods, communities, and basically services that are not equal in different neighborhoods and areas. And then also we see Oregon's historic legacy and current forms of displacement, exclusion, and segregation continues to create barriers and impact lives of Oregonians today. So just because there isn't a historical record of discrimination as such for other protected classes doesn't mean that they weren't still discriminated against. So for example, women, families, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQIA+ community, and others have also suffered the same type of impacts and barriers to housing, even if in some cases that may have appeared in different ways. So we see gentrification as displacement. We see segregated housing patterns and steering. Portland nationally has the 5th highest disparity in arrests by law enforcement. And criminal history will absolutely affect people's housing opportunities. Only 13% of the LGBTQIA plus community that lives in Jackson and Josephine County actually feel safe and welcome. We also see acts of hate and harassment focused towards protected classes, and that has been on the rise since November of 2016. We'll talk a bit more about harassment a little bit later. We also see a disproportionate number of fair housing cases related to disability, and that many people that we receive calls from about disability-related cases are people from other protected classes. About 50% of the contacts that we get on our hotline are specifically related to disability. That's actually in line with the national average. And the national average is that 2/3 of those fair housing cases related to disability have to do with assistance animals. Now, so talking just a little bit about assistance animals, we took a contact from a realtor who said, I've got a home seller that wants to show their home, but wants to say nobody with an assistance animal could come in and look at the home. Is that legal? And well, if the home seller has a disability around allergy, like a really significant disability around allergy, they might be able to say, nobody can bring in their assistance dog. However, there are certain types of assistance dogs that don't really shed, right? So really there's nuance to this. Really, we have to think about this a bit more deeply. I also want to mention we have a housing provider hotline where if you have questions about things that are going on in buying or selling of housing and you want a fair housing perspective, we hope that you would contact us and get some more information from us about that. Also, we see low income and unhoused people are disproportionately members of protected classes. The current number of unhoused people in Oregon is directly tied to the inequitable and unjust history of our housing system and our inability to provide equitable housing for unrepresented and oppressed communities. In many rural communities, and likely in urban ones as well, many might think that the unhoused folks in their communities are from elsewhere, but studies show that the vast majority have long been long-term residents, if not lifetime residents, of the places where they now find themselves without a home. So redlining. Redlining is the discriminatory practice of blocking whole areas from having access to mortgage loans and or other services in order to segregate populations and deny wealth accumulation opportunities. And so really think of that as certain areas of color, like communities of color. We're going to go into redlining a little bit more later. And we'll also talk about steering more later as well, but this concept of steering, what you've heard me say, steering is the discriminatory practice of directing prospective homebuyers away from a house or area that they are interested in, or towards one that they have not expressed interest in when the homebuyer is a member of a protected class, or because the homebuyer is a member of a protected class. So we see this happening still today. So let's talk a little bit about home ownership rates. So this information that I'm going to share comes from a CNN business report from February of 22. So Black home ownership remains at 43.4%, which is lower than when the recession in 2008 hit. Also, Black home ownership is 30% or 30 percentage points behind white home ownership. So the gap in home ownership has been perpetuated by racist systems that were woven into all aspects of American society throughout its history. These systems produce unjust and inequitable housing practices in education, employment, access to social services, as well as access to housing. All of these factors actively contribute to the struggle for people of color to accumulate wealth in this country. Right. And more than anyone as realtors, really, more than anyone, the importance of, that opportunity to own a home, to accumulate wealth, to change opportunity over time for an individual and that individual's family. So I want to move into giving you some red flags now. So what housing discrimination might look like in the home buyer process. So this might be refusing to rent, sell, or finance. So this might be like, that HOA president who says to the realtor, don't sell this unit to anyone with a kid, right? It could be giving out false or inconsistent information. It could be that idea of steering. So steering families towards or away from specific opportunities. We see people being steered towards zip codes based on their race or based on their national origin when they haven't told a realtor that those are the areas that they want to live in. We also see steering for people with disabilities. So housing providers assuming what a person with a disability can or can't do, or maybe their financial ability to adapt a unit, right? That is not a housing provider's job to assume what can happen around that. It's really the person with the disability. It's their job to determine what is an appropriate fit for them. Also, linguistic profiling. We hear about this often where people who have accents or people who maybe speak other languages aren't getting, good or appropriate services. Some other red flags that we hear about in home buying, home selling. This question of what can you tell me about the buyer? Any answer to this question that indicates protected class really borders on very questionable practice. So when a selling agent is saying that, what can you tell me about the buyer, really sticking closer to what the offer is itself. And you can even say, I went to a training about fair housing, and anything that I say that reveals my seller's protected class is problematic under fair housing. Guessing ethnicity or race from people's names, that's also problematic under fair housing. So efforts to determine a protected class of a buyer in order to deny them housing must be avoided. Or I would also say, in order to give them preference over other people, that must also be avoided. I've been in these trainings before where a realtor said, my seller wants to sell their home specifically to somebody that's part of a protected class, so specifically from like a marginalized group. Can they do that? And if you're discriminating or giving different opportunity based on race, color, religion, national origin, for any reason, that's problematic under fair housing. So fair housing says that we should be treating people equally, regardless of protected class. Also, maybe it's that the person that you're working with is told that they don't qualify for a conventional loan, even though when they know that they do. It might be that a home buyer is being screened out from receiving homeowners insurance information via the phone until they can prove that they are legal. So this is something that happens with folks that have access. It might be a mortgage lender or real estate agent asking that home buyer about their religion. Also, some more flags. And when it says you in here, these are slides that are really aimed at home buyers, but I wanted to include them so you see, we had a large grant from HUD a few years back. And so we did a lot of focus groups where people who were home buyers were telling us about the types of discrimination that they were experiencing. And so these bullet points were all things that they had brought up. A home buyer being told that they can't use disability payments to qualify for a loan because they can't prove that those disability payments would continue. It might be a lender asking somebody to fill out extra paperwork and or repeatedly filling out the same paperwork that they already submitted. This happens really often with non-English speakers, and it's really like as a means to try to screen them out from buying a home. So that's problematic. So I want this to be on your radar if you're working with a home buyer that's experiencing this from a bank. It could be a homeowners association denying the application because they don't allow wheelchair ramps in their homes, right? That's also problematic. People with disabilities are allowed to make modifications. So let's talk about steering. This is some more type of housing discrimination, and these are real life examples. So 1979, this case is the Gladstone Realtors versus the Village of Bellwood. 1979, the U.S. Supreme Court concluded in a 7-2 decision that two real estate agencies had intentionally steered Black home buyers towards an integrated neighborhood while steering white home buyers to predominantly white neighborhoods, so not giving equal housing choice. The second one comes from a Newsday article, Long Island Divided. It was published November 17th of 2019. So in this article, it reported findings on steering by realtors in Long Island, New York. they found that overall agents provided white testers on average 50% more listings than they gave to their Black counterparts. And testers, what do I mean by that? So testers are basically like fair housing secret shoppers that are sent out with these sort of secret identities to try to suss out, is housing discrimination actually happening? So trying to suss that out. And so we use testers at our organization. The 1988 Fair Housing Amendments Act that added familial status and disability also gave the right for organizations like ours to use testers. We mainly do testing in rental housing. So really just trying to figure out how are people being treated differently. And so, this article was reporting about that. And we know that there's a lot more steering happening other than just these two incidences. Also, some red flags regarding information sharing, and these are hypothetical situations. So it might be withholding information. So a same-sex couple expressing interest in homes with certain features, such as like a backyard pool, and the real estate agent withholding that information from them. It could also be inconsistent information. So a real estate agent warns a white prospective home buyer against the local school due to low test scores and funding, or low test scores and funding, but then tells a Latinx prospective home buyer that it would be a great school for their kids. Another question that will come up sometimes for realtors is, what about when the buyers ask me, how are the schools? Because so often school performance gets tied to funding, which then gets tied to, funding, which is basically based on that neighborhood, which is based on, right? So predominantly white schools will end up getting better funding. So I had one realtor say, when my buyers ask me how the schools are in this neighborhood, I actually just asked them, what do they mean by that? And she said, I have a neurodivergent child. And so a good school for my neurodivergent child is going to be very different than possibly, or might be very different than the schools that they think are good for their children. So basically saying, what do you mean by that question? Right? So turning that question back if you think that it might be discriminatory in nature. Also, linguistic bias. So there are over 60 million Latinx people that are living in the United States, but too often what we find is that realtors don't have Spanish-speaking agents or Spanish language printed materials. So if your firm does not have a Spanish-speaking staff member or Spanish, language printed materials, you might want to consider adding that. Also, linguistic bias can happen when someone is being denied services due to having an accent that indicates they may have been born outside of the United States. And again, this is information that was coming from our focus group we had. You have probably been hearing a lot about appraisal discrimination in the last few years. So the Brookings Institute found in 2018 that over a 40-year span, homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods faced cumulative devaluation that led to a total of $156 million in losses. That's roughly $48,000 per home. In that same time period, similar kinds of homes in predominantly white neighborhoods had appreciated by an average of $200,000. So let's talk about another story of appraisal discrimination. So in 2021, you may have heard of this. The woman's last name is Duffy. In 2021, there was a case that involved a Black woman living in Indiana who wanted her house appraised for refinancing. She bought the house originally for $100,000 4 years earlier. And when the first appraiser, and she actually did work on her house as well. When the first appraiser came back, they gave her only a value of $125,000. But the homeowner knew from an independent market analysis that the property was likely closer to about $187,000 in value. So what she did then was she actually hired a second appraiser. And this time the value came back at $110,000. So now she knew that something was definitely wrong. So with a third appraiser, what she did was she left her race and gender off of the application. She removed all signs of her race from the home. And then she had a white male friend stand in for her when the appraiser then came. This time the house was valued at $259,000, more than twice as much as the original appraiser. So there may be discrimination happening at all different levels of this home buying process. So also around, the appraisal process as well. All of this discrimination in home appraisal, home buying led to the formation of PAVE. So by 2022, the incidence of discriminatory appraisals had become so prevalent that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, under the direction of Secretary Marcia Fudge, created an interagency task force known as the Property Appraisal and Value Equity Task Force, PAVE, to address the concerns. And you can actually find them at this website, which is www.pave.hud.gov. So let's talk about lenders, redlining, and lasting effects. So redlining, denial of mortgage loans, leads to ultimately disinvestment of the cities or jurisdictions in these communities of color for generations, which then leads to a lack of homeownership opportunities, which then leads to lack of wealth accumulation, which then leads to continued opportunity segregation, wealth, income, housing, school, health outcomes. So disparity in all of those areas. So let's talk about some lender discrimination. This is a case in point. In 2021, there was a case. A bank in Indiana agreed to expand their mortgage lending services to the majority Black neighborhoods in Indianapolis, after complaints were filed that they were redlining certain communities. They also agreed to start a $1.1 million loan subsidy fund in majority Black neighborhoods, as well as to hire a community outreach specialist and 2 mortgage loan officers for those areas. In 2022, a study found that a major bank and lender had rejected half of its Black applicants in refinancing their homes. The rejections came after qualified applicants had paid steep application fees. This second bullet point is an example of what's called predatory inclusion. So let's talk a little bit more about predatory inclusion. So while outright exclusion, such as redlining, has been the primary practice of realtors, banks, and lenders in the history of housing discrimination, once new credit laws and the Fair Housing Act were passed, a new, more insidious practice called predatory inclusion took hold. Predatory inclusion describes how African-American homebuyers were granted access to conventional real estate practices and mortgage financing, but on more expensive and comparatively unequal terms. That comes from a book called Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership. So predatory inclusion was largely responsible for the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. Subprime lending is basically the lending of money to people who, due largely to conditions of the loan, are unable to maintain their repayment schedules. They thus fall into foreclosure with their homes or experience other extremely harmful financial effects. By March of 2008, approximately 8.8 million borrowers had negative equity in their home as a result of this. So let's talk about the creation of homeowners associations. From Jonathan Rothwell's book called A Republic of Equals, this is a quote: "Anti-Black racism motivated some of the strategies used by homeowners associations, such as deed restrictions and covenants that explicitly discriminated against Black people by compelling other owners to avoid selling to them. HOAs perpetuate racial and economic segregation by blocking fair participation in housing markets, thus denying wealth-generating opportunities and upward mobility for many Black people and lower-income families. While the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968, prohibiting racial discrimination in the sale and rental of homes, HOAs still find ways to exclude or discriminate against Black homeowners. A recent report found that neighborhoods with HOAs are less racially diverse and less regulated cities have higher HOAs premiums, leading researchers to believe that residents rely on HOAs to facilitate segregation. So there was a 1948 Supreme Court ruling that made racial covenants in homes no longer legally enforceable, and the Fair Housing Act outlawed them 20 years later. Homeowners associations are often, though, still caught discriminating. So once those racial covenants were considered illegal, that was actually the first civil rights case that was voted for in favor of by the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall was an attorney on, arguing that case before he ended up ultimately joining the bench. But that 1948 case really established that those deed restrictions were not legally enforceable, but there was no entity to basically enforce that they were not enforceable. And so they were considered then private contract. And so home sellers were still, very much working under those racially restrictive covenants. And HOAs then were born out of those restrictive covenants, no longer being able to be enforced at a larger level. So, also, another example, some more examples of HOA discrimination. In 2009, in Arizona, the Maricopa County Superior Court awarded $200,000 to a couple. The husband's African American and the wife is Latina. And it was after they heard that an HOA neighbor said that Black people shouldn't be living here during a remodeling dispute. Another case in 2013, the U.S. Department of Justice ruled or reached a settlement with Townhomes of King Lake Incorporated, which was an HOA, and Vanguard Management Group in Florida. The two groups agreed to pay $150,000 to settle a lawsuit alleging both groups enforced occupancy limits that discriminated against families with children. Also, in Las Vegas, Nevada, the Ardent Homeowners Association had to pay $350,000 in compensatory damages and $285,000 in punitive damages after it was found that the HOA was discriminating against an HOA member who had become disabled. The homeowner now required a service dog, and the HOA continuously denied her and her dog access to the community clubhouse, saying that they would not allow pets. One of the things that we find often with HOAs is that they don't realize that they are subject to fair housing law as well. So if you are working with HOAs around selling homes, things like that, or possibly potentially buyers, and you're coming across problems with the HOAs, you can reach out to our organization and we may be able to help. Now, with that, this is a really good spot to actually take a break. So we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. And then we're going to come back and I will answer the question that's in the Q&A. And then we will also move on to talking about advertising. So 10-minute break, be back at 9:57. All right, folks, start making your way back to your computers. I hope you had a good 10-minute break. I got myself some coffee, which is lovely. So, we have a question in the Q&A, and I want to say if you have questions that come up, please enter those in the Q&A. I'm going to do another Q&A session at the end and respond to any of the questions that have been added in there. So somebody asked this question, and it's a great question. I've heard about apartment complexes that are trying to address historical inequities in rentals that are only accepting tenants with Section 8 housing vouchers rather than the usual not accepting people with Section 8 housing vouchers. Isn't this technically discrimination based on source of income? And the answer is yes, actually. So here's something about the Fair Housing Act that I want to just be really upfront about, is that the Fair Housing Act is based on an equality model rather than an equity model. So equality model means treat everybody exactly the same. If it was an equity model, what we would see happening is laws being passed that help to undo historic harm. So, for example, one of the things we saw in North Portland was African American people being displaced and then the neighborhoods becoming gentrified. And so the city of Portland had tried to create what was called tried to recreate a right to return policy. And that right to return policy was originally written as like, if you were Black, you could get preference, to live in that neighborhood or move back to that neighborhood. But because of how the Fair Housing Act is written, you can't give preference based on race. Even if it's well intended, you cannot give preference based on race, because of then who gets left out of that. So that law that preference policy ended up getting rewritten to basically say if you had historic ties to the neighborhood, you could get preference in right to return, right? So anytime there are preference policies that are written, it has to be actually vetted rigorously and making sure that there are counterbalancing preference policies that don't that mitigate any discriminatory impact that might happen as a result. So thank you for asking that question. That was a really good question. I appreciate it. So if anybody else has questions, please enter that into the Q&A and we will get to those at the end of the next section that we're going through. So this next piece that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about advertising. So fair housing also has to be followed in advertising. That's really, really important. The way in which a unit gets advertised absolutely can impact housing opportunity in many ways. And oftentimes people don't realize, but advertisement might create what's called a chilling effect. So a chilling effect for a protected class or a group that makes them feel not as welcome as other groups. An example of this, it's a rental sort of situation, but there was a case over 20 years ago that came up where in Portland, there are floating homes on the Willamette River, on the east bank of the Willamette River. And there were rules that said that in these floating homes, people had to decorate for the holidays. And that also you couldn't have motorized vehicles on the dock, right? That advertisement is not outright saying people of specific religions that don't decorate for holidays can't live here. People with disabilities that need motorized, wheelchairs can't live here. But the felt effect, the chilling effect of that advertisement is that specific groups can't live there or would not be welcome there. In that case, what ended up happening was there was a Jehovah's Witness family with a disabled grandparent that used a motorized wheelchair that wanted to move into the floating home that was in that community. And the Portland Rowing Club actually owned the moorings of that community. And the Portland Rowing Club basically said, nope, we're not willing. That went to court. The family ended up winning. Case law was, more clearly established around that. So really important when you're thinking about that advertising to make sure that it is open and welcoming. So it is illegal to print or publish any notice, statement, or advertisement for fair housing or for housing that indicates a preference, limitation, or discrimination based on protected class. So again, thinking about, does it have a chilling effect? This applies to newspapers, directories, social media posts, advertisements. So for example, this is an ad that came off of Craigslist. Craigslist gets dinged quite a bit around fair housing issues that come up. So again, thinking about, does the advertisement create a chilling effect for one group over another group? Now, there is a legal exemption in here, and I want to be really clear about that. You heard me say that familial status is a protected class federally. However, there is a loophole around familial status. If a community is 55 and better or 62 and better, they do not have to allow anybody underneath that age threshold to live there. Now, 55 and better, there needs to be a certain amount of units that are set aside for people living with disabilities. I believe it's about 20% of the units. But 62 and better, they do not have to allow anybody under that age threshold. Now, this can actually cause a problem if there's a grandparent that needs to take custody of a grandchild. What might happen in that situation then is that the grandparent has to find alternate housing, right? Because nobody under that age threshold is going to be allowed to live there. Oh, good. I'm answering someone's question. Fantastic. I love seeing that. All right. What else did I want to say about 62 and better? Okay. Hopefully that thought comes back to me and I'll remember that. Okay. So advertising must avoid words that are descriptive of the dwelling, the landlord, or the tenant. So what do I mean by that? Avoid any words indicative of a protected class. Okay. So words like white private residence, Christian housing, adults only housing, English speakers only, Hispanic residents, ideal for a couple, right? So avoiding any of those types of words in advertisement. Also avoid historical catchphrases. So restrictive, private, exclusive, integrated, traditional, board approval, things like that. So in the 1940s, for example, the housing subdivisions of Astor Heights and Byers Addition in Astoria were built with racially restrictive housing covenants added to the original titles. The covenants forbade people of color from purchasing or living in the homes except for the purpose of working there as servants. Other restrictive strategies were less explicit, such as adding the phrase Federal Housing Administration terms to an advertisement for a housing development. During World War II, Federal Housing Administration was subsidizing subdivisions with homes that were only allowed to be sold to white people. So adding the Housing Administration's terms to ads was another point of exclusion. So to be really clear, the FHA, there had been this real estate board of appraisers list as far as who was valued more for a neighborhood. So literally the government, or the real estate appraiser board created this list that said who was by identity most valuable for a neighborhood. You see people from national origins or races that are whiter, more lighter complected at the top of that list. People who are darker complected or from races that are darker complected up towards the bottom of the list. What's really interesting about that list as well is that Northern Italians and Southern Italians were ranked very differently. Northern Italians were like number 2 on the list of 10. Southern Italians were ranked 8, so least desirable or less desirable. Indigenous people didn't even make the list. But with the Italians, the Northern and Southern Italians, they're coming from the same part of the world of this country, but what's different, right? Northern Italians are lighter complected. So literally homes with neighborhoods that were more predominantly of lighter complected individuals were then appraised at higher values. Why am I bringing up this real estate appraisers list? Because the FHA used that same list to determine who they would lend money to or who was allowed to live in specific neighborhoods based on who it was believed would bring most value to those neighborhoods. So during World War II, right, we see the GI Bill being created so people have the ability to access home loans, education, things like that. The GI Bill also, we see the FHA being created to increase access to home ownership as well, during the 1930s and the Depression. And so literally of the $120 billion of loans that went out, less than 2% of loans went to people of color. Less than 2% of those loans went to people of color. So then by adding that phrase like FHA terms, the Federal Housing Administration terms apply here, that was just code. That was to create that chilling effect so people would not have the right to live there. So avoid specific references to protected class landmarks or organizations. So directions can imply, so when you're actually using directions, so avoid using directions like within walking distance of a synagogue, historically Black neighborhood, country club access nearby, LGBTQIA plus community center within a block. So directions to real estate for sale or rent. Directions can imply a discriminatory preference, limitation, or exclusion. It can have that chilling effect. So, for example, references to real estate locations made in terms of racial or national origin, significant landmarks, such as an existing Black development, might be a signal to Blacks, or an existing development known for its exclusion of minorities, right? That country club might be a signal to whites. Specific directions which make references to a racial or national origin significant area may indicate a preference. References to a synagogue, a congregation, a parish may also indicate a religious preference. So realtors should avoid area location descriptions. So names of facilities which cater to a particular racial or national origin or religious group, such as a country club or private school designations, or names of facilities which are used exclusively by one sex may indicate a preference. So being aware of that in your advertisement. Also beware of discriminatory or preferential use of symbols, images, human models, or other visuals. So even if trying to be inclusive, beware of using selective symbols that may be interpreted as steering. Avoid using one national origin or race in your advertising. Use images that are as inclusive and representative as possible so that all populations are welcomed. Using one race or color may suggest that you are advertising to one preferred demographic. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about online advertising, because this is something that we start to see in online advertising, is that advertisers have the ability to target ads to or away from specific neighborhoods or areas with a disparate demographics, predominantly Black, Hispanic, low income, etc. So if you look at this ad more closely, on the left-hand side, it's basically saying who the advertiser is trying to target with their ad. Oftentimes these online advertisements will allow people to exclude, right? So this exclude moms, corporate moms, stay-at-home moms, new moms, moms of grade school kids, moms of high school kids, fit moms, green moms, big city moms, trendy moms, soccer moms, or moms, preschool kids, and parents, all parents, right? So this is specifically, sorry moms, right? Sorry moms. This is specifically trying to discriminate against families that have children. So this is problematic. So also avoid selectively advertising some units as equal housing opportunities and not other units. So again, that consistency is really, really important. Also, use objective discriminations of the property and the amenities. So charming craftsmen with hardwood floors, pool and playground on premises, located at and using the address. Again, not using those sort of neighborhood markers which could indicate protected class. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. So make sure that your advertising complies with fair housing law by focusing on the property and its amenities, not on who the ideal renter or buyer might be. So advertising and marketing must comply with fair housing law by focusing information on the property and its amenities. Oh, wait, sorry, that was on its amenities rather than by attempting to attract the ideal renter or buyer. So I'm going to take a break real quick and look at the questions in the Q&A. before we move on to some practice points for you all. So here it says, within the context of renting, isn't there Mrs. Murphy's exemption that allows discrimination even on the basis of protected class when the owner or landlord is living in the property and renting out a portion of the property that they live within? If I remember properly, the Mrs. Murphy exemption doesn't apply to advertising, which means a person may be renting a property with the intent to discriminate that cannot advertise that fact. Is that accurate? I'm so glad that you're asking this question. So Mrs. Murphy's exemption does not apply in the state of Oregon because the state of Oregon has created some protections written into the law that basically block that type of discrimination. Now there is some loophole. So you cannot advertise in a discriminatory fashion, but let's say I live in the house, I live in this house that I live in, and I'm looking for a roommate and I identify as being a woman. I can advertise the room. I have to advertise the room, equally. I can't say only want a woman roommate, but when I screen people that come in, because there's shared living space, like a shared bathroom, a shared bedroom, shared living room, I could say that I only want to live with another person who is a woman or identifies as a woman. That was established in a case called roommates.com if you're interested in reading up a little bit more about that. But otherwise, that Mrs. Murphy's exemption doesn't really qualify. Now, let's say that I'm renting a room out of my house, but let's say that my house is 2 floors and like I've got an apartment, like it's really more like an apartment below, like in the basement, and I don't have shared living space. Then in that case, I can't discriminate based on sex. So, interesting to know about. I'm certainly glad that you asked that question. And again, folks, if anybody else has a question, please enter that into the chat and I'm happy to get to those. Okay. So moving along, let's talk a little bit more about just some practice points for realtors. So I just want to be really upfront. When we had that HUD grant that allowed us to do focus groups about what housing discrimination in home buying looks like, we did a focus group with people who are buying homes, so actual consumers. We did a focus group with social service organizations as well that are serving people who are home buyers. And then we did a focus group of realtors where we actually had realtors come and talk to us. Or we went and actually talked to realtors about what is the type of discrimination that you are experiencing. And one of the things that we heard really clearly is that there can also be discrimination that gets directed right at that realtor. And that can then impact their home buyers' access to housing, right? Or housing opportunity. So what we're finding is that some realtors of color are leaving their headshots off of promotional materials. Sometimes they're also asking white colleagues to show homes or maybe to stand in for an open house because that changes housing opportunities, prospects of somebody buying. The safety issues of buyers of color in certain neighborhoods are also affecting realtors of color. So, you may be following some of those news stories where people are, going into a neighborhood and then they have neighbors that are calling the police saying that person doesn't belong in this neighborhood, those kinds of things. That's also happening to realtors of color as well, who are experiencing that level of harassment. So realtors of color may also fear reprisals if they report. They may fear a loss of clients. Also, realtors in general may fear reprisals for advocating for fair housing. We talked to one realtor, and she's a person of color, and she said, I basically stood up for fair housing and what was going on, and then somebody wrote a bad review online for me, which you can't undo those bad reviews, right? You can't erase them. Other people might not actually just know how to report, or maybe people don't want to report their colleagues. But the reality is, if we're not standing up for fair housing, right, then we're just going along with status quo. And that doesn't change the problems that are at hand where people are getting discriminated against in housing. So it is important to increase knowledge and awareness around like annual trainings. So including in those annual trainings within your firm, include the safety of realtors of color as well as part of the topic area. Also, it's important to acknowledge the personal impact of housing discrimination and also the professional and societal need for reporting and changing the system. So I want to talk a little bit about how to report as well. So if you notice that there's something that's funky going on or something that is questionable, it's a really good idea to start to create a log of what's happening, right? Date, time, who's saying what, what's happening, what's going on, what's sort of getting your, your feelers kind of, tingling that there's something going on. So create some kind of log. If there's any type of evidence, like written evidence, that's great, or pictures that can be taken, that's really great. And then with that information, you can actually contact us. We have a housing provider hotline, or you can contact our housing discrimination hotline. We're also not the only game in town. People can also contact HUD or BOLI as well. HUD hears about the federal fair housing violations, so those federally protected classes. BOLI hears about the state protected classes. So several different places that you could report to if you think there's housing discrimination going on against your client. Any questions about those pieces that I just went over? I'm going to give it just a minute in the Q&A if folks have something that they want to drop in. Okay, it doesn't look like anybody's got any questions in the Q&A, so I will keep going. I also, since I touched on the topic of harassment, I actually wanted to bring some of that information into this training as well and talk about harassment, because harassment between one homeowner and another homeowner happens. We know that that happens. You heard me say that we know that harassment's been on the rise since November of 2016. If one homeowner is harassing another homeowner, that's actually not legal based on fair housing. That's something that could get reported. So if you're working with somebody, or even if it's a prospective home buyer that's looking at a place and, the neighbors are starting to harass that prospective home buyer because of their race or their color, their protected class, that home buyer actually has rights. So that's absolutely something that can get reported to HUD or could get reported to an organization like ours or possibly BOLI. And so, helping the person understand, the home buyer understand what their rights are could be really, really important. So when is harassment a fair housing issue? So if harassment is happening in housing, right, in a housing transaction, if harassment is based on protected class, then it becomes a fair housing issue. It very clearly becomes a fair housing issue if it is happening within a housing transaction. So looking at a home, living in a home, moving out of a home, if all of that's, and it's based on protected class, that then becomes a fair housing issue. What we know is that there is an increase of hateful harassment that's been going on. So we have been getting more reports of it, and it really, in housing, which means that that's really reflective of a broader trend that's happening, across the state of Oregon. The Southern Poverty Law Center tracks acts of harassment, and there's been a steady and dramatic increase since November of 2016. A lot of that harassment gets aimed at immigrants, Muslims, African Americans, Jews, women, people who are part of the LGBTQI plus community. What we know is that one third of all acts of hate and harassment actually happen in housing. 1/3. It's a huge number. Only 1 in 15 acts of hate and harassment ever get reported. Why is that? When we start looking at these communities that are targeted, immigrants, Muslims, African Americans, Jews, women, LGBTQIA plus communities, these might be groups that don't have the best relationships with those agencies or organizations that they would report to. So that might be part of why these acts don't get reported. Now, around housing discrimination, only 1 in 10 acts of housing discrimination also gets reported. So that's very, very low. So you as a realtor can actually help with that, right? Help increase the number of reports that are happening. So let's talk about forms of harassment. It could be words, especially if it's a threat and or continuing. Usually what we see is that over time, harassment starts to escalate. It could be actions like spying, touching, leaving derogatory messages on cars. It could be through social media or virtual means like emails, texts, social media. In that case, if you are working with a home buyer that's experiencing some type of harassment like that, it's a good idea for them to take screenshots and to get actually some kind of a proof. It could be displaying hate symbols like swastikas, right? In most cases, we see that it's more than one incident, but even a severe incident qualifies. And again, there's a national uptick in harassment against protected classes. So not all harassment is a fair housing issue. You know, we did a training in Southern Oregon where there was these 2 elderly women that lived, you know, in a housing complex, and they didn't like each other. They just didn't like each other, and they would, harass and berate each other, but it was never related to a protected class. Ultimately, they ended up getting into a fight in the laundry room. One threw a full bottle of laundry detergent at the other one. But again, it wasn't related to protected class. So in that case, it was not a fair housing issue. Maybe it's her son took my son's bike. That's not necessarily related to fair housing. But if it's her son took my son's bike and her son has been harassing my son because of our religion, then that does become a fair housing issue. It might be like, his dog pooped on my front lawn. Not a polite neighbor, but that's not necessarily fair housing related. If the guy is only allowing his dog to poop on the lawn and there's been other types of harassment based on protected class, then yeah, maybe that is an act of harassment, but otherwise it's probably just somebody not being a great neighbor. So I want to give you some examples of sexual harassment, or of harassment that has actually happened. So sexual harassment, if it's happening in housing, then it is fair housing related because that is harassment based on the protected class of sex. So in home buying, where we might see this is like, if there's, workmen that are coming in to do work to prep the house for sale, right? Like maybe it's the buyer said this type of work has to get done, before, but then the people that are coming in to do the work are actually like sexually harassing, right? That's problematic. There was a case that came out of Florida where there was a neighbor of a lesbian couple that kept harassing them and then leaving dog poop on the porch of their mobile home, right? That's problematic. That harassing because they were lesbians going along with the leaving of the dog poop, that, makes it much more clear that this is harassment based on protected class. Prior to my time working at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, I actually worked at an organization called Cascade AIDS Project. So I worked with people living with HIV and AIDS that were at 200% of the federal poverty level or below. I also taught tenant education, and I had somebody come through my class that was experiencing housing discrimination, harassment by neighbors, and the landlord was basically saying there's nothing I could do. His neighbors were harassing him because he was gay. They were calling him all kinds of names. They were throwing trash on his balcony. Somebody peed on his front door. Another person smashed in the windshield of his car, calling him all kinds of names. And he kept reporting to the landlord, and the landlord kept saying, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. But that's actually not true. If it is the same landlord over 2 different residents or tenants, and one is harassing the other, the landlord has a legal responsibility to investigate and take action. In this case, the landlord didn't investigate it, didn't take action, so basically wasn't enforcing the rental agreement and wasn't enforcing it specifically around this person being a gay man that was reporting. And so ultimately, he ended up negotiating to leave without a lease break fee and also got a $20,000 settlement. And to be clear, it's not the neighbor that was doing the harassment that paid the $20,000 settlement. It was the landlord who was not enforcing the lease agreement, the rental agreement that requires people to behave within community. There was another case that came out of a retirement community. And this is a really interesting case because it was a retirement community, a bunch of condos, and one person had an assistance animal for their disability. And in this retirement community, it was a bunch of lawyers, like retired lawyers that lived there. And they kept harassing this tenant that had the assistance animal. So in that case, the housing provider did actually proactively, or the HOA did actually proactively work to try to educate the people that lived there, say, yes, this person with disability is allowed to have their animal. You need to stop harassing them. There was another case that came out of an HOA community where there was a man that lived in the community. He had traumatic brain injury. He'd been in a motorcycle accident. And as a result, it affected the way that he walked, affected the way that he spoke. And he was getting harassed by the children that lived in, in that community, that HOA community. He kept reporting it to the landlord, and he kept reporting it to the HOA. And the HOA is basically like, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. But in the CC&Rs, it's very clear, right, about how people are supposed to behave. And the HOA is allowed to hold parents accountable for the behavior of the children. And the HOA wasn't doing that. Ultimately, he went for a swim in this, condo community in the pool that was there. He went for a swim, and the kids stole his, phone, keys, wallet, shoes, towel, like everything. And that was at the point where then he ended up getting an attorney. That settled for $160,000. And to be clear, again, that's the HOA that's having to pay the $160,000 because they had said, there's nothing I can do in that case, when frankly, there is. Also could be ongoing intense racial and sexual harassment. This was a case where there was a woman that lived in a condo in an HOA community, and she was getting severely sexually harassed, severely racially harassed by one of the neighbors. And the HOA was not holding that person accountable for their behavior, wasn't even, assigning them the fees that they can, assign them. That case settled for $550,000. And again, that was the HOA that had to pay for that. So you may hear about this type of discrimination happening in HOA communities, where your home buyers have gotten homes. So I really wanted to put this on your radar to know that that was there. Okay, we have a question in the Q&A, and it said, if a landlord has a situation where tenants are displaying flags that conflict with one another, my thought is the one is displaying an Israeli flag and the other is displaying a Palestinian flag, or more recent, Justin Alito's wife's flag used as speech against the neighbor thing that has been in the news. And both tenants complain to the landlord that the other tenant is harassing on a basis of protected class through the display of that flag. What is the advice to the landlord? Is this just a, do your best, ask good questions? It feels like the average landlord is not equipped to be a referee. This is such a challenging case that comes up, and it comes up often. So what we will see oftentimes is landlords having rules in their rental agreement that says no flags being allowed to display, no symbols being allowed to display, that show outwardly from the rental unit, those kinds of things. So yeah, we'll see landlords actually create rules within their lease that say, no flags, no signs that have symbols of any sort being able to be displayed, outside of the unit where it's visible to, the rest of the community. And they do that specifically because of these sorts of situations that start to come up. Thank you for that question. Really appreciate it. So you heard me talk a lot about harassment based on protected class. So let's talk about how fair housing laws get enforced. So most commonly, if there's housing discrimination happening, we get contacted first. So we get 2,000 contacts a year. We resolve the majority of fair housing issues through advocating. Again, we speak English, Spanish, we use the language bank for issues outside of that. There are also no income requirements for people to use our services. We can also help to file a complaint with HUD or the Oregon Civil Rights Division, which is BOLI. That's who hears complaints around state protected classes. Then comes the investigation. We're really trying to figure out, did discrimination actually occur? Investigation tools that we might use, it might be that we're using those testers, those secret shoppers. We're also looking at, is there any kind of a paper trail? Is there a log that was created? Also, we're looking at, is this a dwelling under fair housing law? Enforcers of these laws could include BOLI, HUD, State Attorney General's Office, U.S. Department of Justice, and or a legal aid attorney, a civil rights attorney, and outcomes really vary, right? So is it that somebody is contacting our hotline? Maybe you are contacting our hotline just because you want more information, right? You've got a situation that came up where, the selling agent said, well, we don't want any, like the seller said they don't want any kind of X, Y, and Z living in this neighborhood. They said that the neighbors aren't going to like this kind of person that's living here, right? Is it that you're wanting just more information, or is it that somebody's, experienced one of those like acts of hate and harassment, those really significant acts of hate and harassment? Outcomes are really going to vary. It might be that we step in and we do some education. Maybe the realtor feels very comfortable with advocating, and so it might be we're just educating the realtor. It might be that we're having to step in and do something more significant, like file a claim, or it might be that we need to refer something to our attorney pool, where there's an attorney that's interested in taking on the case. So outcomes really, really vary. And you saw those cases that I gave earlier where there are different settlement amounts attached. And it really just depends on the case as far as what type of settlement gets actually attached to that. Now, if you would like to be a tester for us or help us uncover housing discrimination, or somebody that might be interested, we would love more testers in our tester pools. We really need more realtors that are, or more testers that are representative of folks that are calling us to report discrimination that's been happening as well. And if you would like to contact us, our Fair Housing Hotline is open for phone calls Tuesdays from 9 to noon, or you can email us at any time, even outside of that window. That housing provider hotline, you can contact and leave a message on that housing provider contact or a hotline, and my colleague Glenda will get back to you with any questions that you may have. I'm happy to answer those questions. All right, so we do have evaluations for this course. And I'm going to drop the link to the evaluation in the chat, and I hope that you fill that out. And I left time for questions, so I'm hoping more folks have questions. Please enter any questions you have into the Q&A for me, and we can chat about those things. And also, if you like, you can enter questions into the chat as well. That is open for everyone. Oh, this is a great question. Okay. If I were to give you all 3 things that you can do as realtors in the next couple months to be better at our job, what would they be? Well, I would say one thing is just being here and getting the education, so possible discrimination is on your radar. So you already knocked one thing off that I would have said. So that's fantastic. Another thing that I would say is, that question, that common question about tell me about your buyer, right? That happens in almost every single housing transaction. And so if you could be really clear about that question, oh my goodness, sorry. I realized I just sent you all the link to what is a weevil. I had a coworker ask what weevils were. And so I added that link as your evaluation link. So I apologize for that. Let me get you the actual evaluation link instead. I have to look through my email really quick. And apologies for anybody who did not want to read about weevils. Okay, here's the appropriate evaluation link. And I appreciate that. I know people are actually looking at the evaluation if you are saying that that was not the right one. Okay, the correct evaluation link is actually in the chat now. Okay, so first thing, get education, right? That's one of the number 1 things that you can do. Number 2 things is intercept those problematic questions. Tell me about your buyer. Are the schools good? Right? Any of those types of questions, just, um, really come up with language and how you want to respond. So tell me about your buyer. Anything I say related about the protected class of the buyer could be problematic. How are the schools? What do you mean by that? Right? Or are the schools good? What do you mean by that? So asking that question. And then I would say the third thing, so good. Okay. The third thing I would say is find ways to interrupt problematic behavior, which that can be the more challenging, right? That can definitely be the more challenging, but find ways to interrupt the problematic behavior that's coming up or that you're seeing. Is it that you create some mechanism for inside of your firm that you are, reporting people, right? Holding one another accountable and holding one another accountable in ways where people are allowed to learn and grow from mistakes that they might be making. I think that's really important. I'm going to add a fourth also, that advertisement stuff, right? Advertisement. We do trainings with RMLS also around advertisement. So they're also using fair housing practices when you're turning in, information about advertising a unit or advertising a home or a condo for sale. So they're getting training as well, but as long as you also can be aware of that as well. Thank you for that question. That was great. Next one, where's the evaluation form? Thanks so much for asking that. I entered that into the chat, and the appropriate one should be there. And the last question was also about the evaluation form. Somebody says they already did their Weevil CE. Oh my goodness, you're very funny, you guys. I really appreciate that. So when will we get protection for protected classes in commercial real estate? And is there anything in place currently? Oh my gosh, that is a really good question. And I don't know, because the Fair Housing Act really deals with residential and dwellings. And I would guess, and I don't know 100% on this for sure, that when we're talking about commercial real estate, I would guess that the laws that affect that, I don't know. I don't know about laws that are affecting that, but I think that that's a really important thing to bring up, and I'm actually going to add that to my list of things to look at. One of the other things that we hear oftentimes in these trainings is, what about when like a housing provider is getting discriminated against, by a tenant, right? Or let's say that you're getting discriminated against. What we understand is that employment law actually would cover that when a housing provider is getting discriminated against in housing transactions. It's not the Fair Housing Act, because the Fair Housing Act really protects the consumer of housing rather than folks who are on the housing provider side of it. So Jen, I really appreciate your question around the commercial real estate. I don't have the answer. If you want to send me your email address, I'll do some digging and I can get you that answer. Happy to do that. Somebody said that commercial realtors could be held accountable by NAR. Thank you, Chris, for that. And the code of ethics. What's really interesting about the Realtor Code of Ethics? So before the Fair Housing Act, the Realtor Code of Ethics actually said that it was considered unethical to sell a home in an all-white neighborhood to a person of color, and the realtors would actually lose their fair housing or lose their realtor license for doing that. So you start to think about different systems that were put in place to continue patterns of segregation. If realtors were trying to sell a home in an all-white neighborhood to a person of color, they would literally lose their realtor license. So the different systems and levels of discrimination go really, really deep. So what about housing developments that are for adults only or over 55 retirement communities? Are those okay? And Karen, yes, we did talk about that a little bit before when we were talking about advertising. That is one of the loopholes that is allowed in fair housing, is that a retirement community 55 or older is allowed to say that they are for adults only. So nobody under that age threshold could qualify. Now, interestingly, why that why that loophole got built into the law is specifically because when groups are in the 1980s were pushing to have familial status added as a protected class, who gets out to vote? Retirement communities. They basically pushed back and they said, we raised our kids. We don't want to live in communities with kids. So that protected class would not have ended up passing if there were not the loophole built in for the retirement communities. The retirement communities that are 55 and better, they do have to hold aside a certain amount of units for people with disabilities that are under the age threshold. That's, I think, about 20%. At 65 and better, they can say only people 65 and better can live in those communities. The only loophole to that might be if somebody has like a live-in caregiver that's under that age threshold, because that caregiver isn't considered a tenant or somebody that's living there. They're considered a medical tool, but otherwise they can't have family members living with them that are under 65. So that is, or under 62. So that is a legal loophole around that. All right, Jen, I got your email address and I will be emailing you the answer to that question. I'm going to try to do some digging and see what I can find. Great question. And other than that, if there's no more questions, we are done with our training for today. Again, please fill out that evaluation and really appreciate your time, your energy, being here, your interest in fair housing, your interest in, creating a more equitable community in Oregon. That's really wonderful. Appreciate you all so much. Have a great day. Oh, Alma, I think Oregon Realtors, they recorded the training, so I believe they will have the link available. I will also share my presentation with the notes, also with Katie at Oregon Realtors, so she can send that out if she's sending out the link. And Katie, are you around to answer how people get their credits?
Yeah, I'll get those processed and emailed out to you within 2 weeks.
Wonderful. All right, folks, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Shyle. I appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you too. Bye.
All right. Bye, everybody.